Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Russell Crowe is an actor possessed, and maybe not because he's acting in The Exorcism. Troubled actor Anthony Miller, played by Russell Crowe, is about to star in a new Exorcism film called The Georgetown Project, while trying to repair the relationship with his daughter Lee, played by Ryan Simpkins, who is also working on the film as a production assistant. As filming begins, Anthony struggles with his performance, and gradually his behaviour starts to become more erratic and disturbing. Are his personal demons resurfacing, or is the supernatural crossed from the film he's working on to reality? The Exorcism has had a very rocky road to the screen. The film was originally shot under the title The Georgetown Project, which is the name of the film within the film, all the way back in 2019. That's right, this movie has been sat on the shelf for the best part of 5 years while they figured out what to do with it. The film was written by Joshua John Miller and M.A. Fortin, and Miller also directs the movie. They were the creators of The Final Girls itself, a meta-horror riff with Taissa Farmiga jumping into the slasher movie that her mother starred in. And that film is quite well regarded. I never caught up with it myself, but I know in horror circles it's quite popular, so they do have good pedigree. And the idea was that they were going to do reshoots because they knew the film had problems, but of course that got delayed by COVID for a very long time. In fact, they only picked up for reshoots all the way in 2023. So several years after principal photography, they reconvened to shoot new footage for the movie. And I think the only reason why this is the case is that it appears to have been resurrected by the success of The Pope's Exorcist, which Russell Crowe actually went and made after this movie, but ended up getting released beforehand. But that made a surprising amount of money. So that meant that actually Russell Crowe in an Exorcism movie did prove to be viable. Is there some way of salvaging this project? What ended up happening is that you now have this new movie explicitly trading on a film that Crowe did after he did this one. The poster looks strikingly similar to The Pope's Exorcist, to the point where several people think that I'm actually talking about the same movie and not a different one. They even have the same colour scheme, and even the new titling seems to evoke The Pope's Exorcist. Now we have The Exorcism, which is a far more generic and unspecific title. The end result is exactly what you'd expect it to be, and arguably ends up even more meta than originally intended. A troubled film about the making of a troubled film. As you might have noticed from the original title, this is explicitly a riff on The Exorcist, and I don't just mean in the usual way that most Exorcism films are a retread of The Exorcist. I mean this is explicitly referencing the OG movie. Georgetown is a big giveaway to that. In fact, the original title of The Georgetown Project, in universe, it sounds like it's just a code name for it. In fact, there's an early scene where Anthony and his daughter are talking over the script, and they ask him, oh, so this is a remake of, yep, but they can't say they're remaking The Exorcist explicitly because for legal reasons they can't. They don't have the rights to that movie. So there's a lot of wink, wink, nudge, nudge, you know what we mean. We're kind of remaking The Exorcist. There's enough specific details in, say, the way the house is designed that it evokes the movie, but is not crossing into legally dubious territory. But the fact that the characters are actually remaking The Exorcist in universe, it ended up predicting Exorcist Believer, which shot after this movie did principal photography. It predates that, but in a weird way, it actually ends up predicting that movie's existence and has several weird coincidences, like the fact that the girl in the movie within the movie is played by a black actor, just like one of the possessed girls in Exorcist Believer. That's very fittingly meta and mind-bending for a movie which in its premise alone is already very reminiscent of Wes Craven's New Nightmare or Shadow of the Vampire, films that present movie making as its own kind of personal hell, because it's so hard to get a film made, as The Exorcism will very much attest to. But they're also about the blurring between fantasy and reality, not quite knowing where the screen ends, and that's especially true in the case of New Nightmare, where they incorporated aspects of the actors' real lives into the movie. And The Exorcism could do something interesting with its idea, using the kind of tropes of an exorcist movie as a way of exploring an actor's personal demons, their own personal problems. Unfortunately, though, the movie is so scattershot in its approach that it suffers from what I like to call metaphor failure. When you're constructing an allegory, it typically helps to try and make it specific, make it about a particular thing. That way it can be easily read and understood by the audience. They know that this thing is really about that. Unfortunately, what The Exorcism does is, instead of making it about a particular demon, it uses the possession to encompass all of Anthony's demons, and that is simply far too much for the movie to deal with. So the primary one is his alcoholism. He's just come out of rehab. He's trying to rebuild his career after spending a decade essentially pissing it away most of the time. It's clear that at some point he was a big A-list actor and then he really fell off. But also he's carrying a lot of personal guilt for the fact that in the time that he was drinking, he was an absent father for his daughter at the time where her mother was dying, and so he has a lot of repair work that he has to do with his daughter. He's trying to rebuild his life, and then he comes into this role and starts to become very nervous about it. It starts to consume him. And if it was just simply those two things, it would work reasonably well. But then, for some inexplicable reason, and I don't know if this is part of the film's added reshoots, but they also add an additional element in that Anthony was an altar boy as a child, and he was abused in the church. So he's also carrying a lot of guilt about his faith. He used to go to mass, he still remembers the words, but he's lapsed. And I suppose if you try to psychoanalyze it, it makes sense in that what happened to him as a kid led into the drinking, that led into the destruction of his personal and professional career. It makes sense like that, but as a metaphor, it's very convoluted, because you spend most of the movie going, okay, is this about what happened with the drinking, or is this about what happened to him as a child? The movie just conflates the two, and instead it just ends up being ill-disciplined and ill-focused. Unlike in The Pope's Exorcist, where Crowe was playing the role very campily, almost knowingly, in this film he takes the part seriously. He's trying very hard to bring out the dramatic side of the material, especially as Anthony is being hectored by a domineering, often abusive director that is taking advantage of his personal trauma and trying to provoke him in order to get the truth out of his character. So Crowe starts out the movie as being the main character, but then over the course of it, as he becomes more and more possessed, he ends up actually being something of a peripheral figure that pops in and out of the narrative. He becomes somewhat lost, and so that means that there isn't really much that Crowe can really do with that character, especially as story-wise the focus shifts more from Anthony to Lee. And I really liked Ryan Simpkins' performance as Lee. I think they do a great job of characterising someone that has grown up with their father being in the public eye, having all their struggles being well publicised, and how difficult and demanding that can be on already the problems that are happening privately. The fact that the movie shifts its main character from Anthony to Lee, in a better movie that probably could have worked, but in this film it just ends up adding another metaphor into the mix, because now we get a fourth reading in that for Lee it becomes like living with an addictive, abusive parent, especially as they believe at first that they are simply just reverting back to their alcoholism, and there's moments where Anthony, possessed, starts taunting them about it. You don't speak to your father like that. It just ends up cluttering the movie even further, and really the movie perhaps should have been more tightly focused on Lee to begin with, rather than focusing on Anthony. The problem with The Exorcism is that it can't really decide what its identity is, whether it's a meta-horror or a psychological drama, and it ends up really being neither in terms of execution. One of the more interesting things about the movie is that Kevin Williamson is a producer on it, who was the writer of Scream, so we have yet another Wes Craven connection there, and the movie is definitely playing around with the idea of curse cursed films, cursed productions, as much the production of The Exorcist itself, but it doesn't really know what angle it's actually trying to take it from. There are points in the movie where it almost seems to be playing around as a dark comedy. They're filming the possession scene within the movie with Chloe Bailey's Blake in full possession makeup, and Anthony is struggling to get the lines, and between takes, she actually goes over to him and says, "Are you alright?" Which looks absolutely ridiculous because she's in full demonic makeup with scratches down her face and contacts in her eyes. That's a funny image, but that's weirdly lacking elsewhere in the movie. If you're going to pick a tone, at least pick a consistent one. There's actually a moment where they're at a party for the production, and Adam Goldberg's director literally says, "It's a horror movie, but underneath, it's a psychological drama." And you go, oh, that's a clever, playful wink, because he's talking about the movie they're making, but he's actually talking about the movie we're watching. Isn't that smart? And instead it just comes across as really being quite smarmy, but at least it tells us what the filmmakers were intending for the material. But okay, let's take this as a drama about someone that finds themselves irredeemable, which is exactly what Adam Goldberg's director describes Anthony as. You are irredeemable. And then having to be pulled back from that brink that they actually are worthy of being saved. The problem is the horror and the drama work at cross purposes to each other. In fact, they often undermine each other, because the drama establishes this as being set in a real world, in our world, and the horror stuff is all cliches you've seen in movies. And the greatest example of this is a sequence where Anthony goes to the bottom floor of this house set and has a massive possessed episode in front of the entire crew. He is bending his spine backwards in a grotesque and CGI-assisted way. Everyone's screaming. The lights are flickering the entire time through very supernatural means. Then they cut out entirely and he's teleported over to the table and he's slamming his head repeatedly into it. And this spectacle, everyone in this moment should have immediately gone, oh my god, our main actor is literally possessed. It has become a real-life horror movie. Instead, what ends up happening is the director of the movie goes, oh, yeah, he's having some troubles with his drinking. I'm sorry, what? No. And that is how the horror elements undermine the drama, because it makes it completely implausible. And this doesn't help that there are several moments like this. There's a moment where Anthony falls backwards out of a several-story window, and there's no explanation for how his character survived. The movie just cuts to black at that point, and then just expects the audience to make their own explanation for how he managed to survive that. And one really has to feel sorry for the cast, because they really are trying with the material. It's a bad film, but they're not giving bad performances in it. In fact, I think that David Hyde Pierce is fantastic in this movie. He gives perhaps the best performance in it as a priest who serves as an advisor to both the film itself and to Anthony's performance. And while most priests in horror films are usually quite apoplectic and screaming at the top of their lungs, Pierce actually decides to go quiet with it. He plays this priest as being quite thoughtful and contemplative, and actually becomes someone that Lee can talk to, someone that she can actually confide in and give advice to her, and it's a quite gentle performance, an unusually quite sincere one as well. And I thought that this character was perhaps the best example of it actually subverting a cliche. Unfortunately, the rest of the cast are dealing with roles that appear to have been severely truncated in post-production. Again, we'll get to that in a moment. For instance, Sam Worthington gets third billing in this movie, and he plays an actor that is meant to be the sidekick to Anthony's priest within the film, and he's clearly eyeing the lead role, especially as Anthony starts to wobble in the role. He's this young up-and-coming actor. This character is set up fairly early on in the movie, and then he disappears for a long stretch of it. He disappears for a very, very long time in this movie, and then reappears at about the hour mark or so, and you know kind of where that's going very quickly. Worthington is stuck playing a role that very much is almost a borderline cameo in the released version, but even more so than that, you have Adrian Pastar, who plays the pre-title kill in this movie. The opening sequence follows the actor that was cast as the priest before Anthony, and then of course something supernatural ends up taking him out of the role and out of the rest of his life. And Pastar's role is so small that he literally dies before his screen credit appears. But as I keep saying, it's pretty clear the movie had major problems in the editing room. How major? I don't think I've seen a movie that looks this jumbled up and this barely releasable since The Snowman. Oh yeah, it genuinely reminded me of that. It's pretty clear that there's footage that they shot for the movie and then cut out of it, or there's footage that they meant to shoot and never got around to, and then there's footage that they shot, of course, much, much later that they've had to graft into the movie, and then there are scenes that appear to have been moved around and restructured. In fact, there are scenes that often cut to black very awkwardly with strange time jumps, and it's not entirely clear how much time has actually elapsed. It feels like the kind of movie that was cut apart in the editing room to try and restructure it and rearrange it into some form that actually worked, trying to move scenes around and compensate for missing footage, and the result is just really messy. And then on top of that, you've got the ADR trying to work miracles, like the fact that you've got new dialogue from characters that are clearly off screen or not looking towards camera. They're so blatant about adding in new dialogue that at points they actually cut to close-ups that they shot previously, and they just put them over old dialogue. You can clearly see that the actors are saying completely different tail ends of lines to what's actually being heard. There's also elements that are very prominently introduced that don't have any kind of payoff in the released version. For example, early on in the movie, they're walking backstage and they encounter this very creepy life mask of Russell Crowe just sitting there on a table, just this empty, lifeless, but lifelike face just staring back at them. And the camera lingers on this for ages, just slowly going into this mask. It's an uneasy and unsettling image, and it's clearly something that we're meant to remember. It's setting up the idea that this is going to be used for a stunt double of some kind to replace him in a shot at some point, but then it never comes up again. It's just a creepy image in the final version of the movie that it never comes back to, and that struck me as very odd. And there are several things in the Exorcism that feel like that, and this results in a movie that feels like it has gaping holes in logic, and it feels like the movie doesn't really know, again, what it's supposed to be doing, and it just makes for a very confusing and unintentionally disorientating experience for the viewer as they try to actually follow the story along. And then on top of this, you add in the reshoots, which stick out like an absolute sore thumb, especially because there's an early scene with Russell Crowe confessional that just seems wedged into the movie. There's no reason for him to be in a confessional at that point, and it's pretty evident that both Crowe and Simpkins in particular, they were shot completely separately. They're new footage, much of which goes into the film's new ending. Simpkins looks completely different to how they did in the rest of the movie, which clearly signifies that this was not part of the original production. But Crowe, his new scenes appear to have taken place entirely in one confessional booth that they picked up later for the production. The credits show there are Los Angeles and Australia units, which suggests that they almost could have shot these reshoots on an iPhone almost if there wasn't so many credits on them, because there's literally just a handful of pickup shots that anyone could have done. You just hire a church and Russell Crowe, get him for an afternoon, boom, you've got 2 new scenes for the movie. But all these attempts to try and patch up and salvage the movie, none of them address the core underlying issue in that for a horror movie, it's just not that scary, despite the fact that it has all these super loud jump scares all throughout it. They really jack up the soundtrack in all the scare scenes, and that did catch me off guard. on occasion. There's a moment where Russell Crowe just jumps out from the side of the screen that really jolted me, and that wasn't because it was scary, it's because I was alarmed by the soundtrack. And it's a real shame that the movie doesn't play more into this idea of a movie within a movie, trying to bleed in between worlds, you know, kind of playing off the fact that what's happening in the scenes is actually happening in reality. That's the fun part of a movie like this. You could really play around with this core conceit, and instead, the movie doesn't. Instead, it goes into the standard tropes for this kind of subgenre, especially by the time the ending rolls around, where it goes into deeply conventional territory and largely loses the self-aware element, aside from the finale setting, which is a cold room set. Because if you don't know, the ending of The Exorcist was shot on such a set. That's why the actors genuinely look like they're freezing and you can see their breath. It's because the set was refrigerated. So The Exorcism pays homage to that by setting the ending, The Exorcism, on one of these sets, but it doesn't lean into that enough. Instead, it just feels like you're watching the standard kind of exorcism that you'd see in all of these kind of movies. None of it particularly stands out. If you were hoping with all its production problems that The Exorcism would be so bad it's good, it's not. It's just bad. It's a curiously flat and inert film, and it's very easy to see why it was shelved for so long. It just simply doesn't work. It's a potentially promising idea. You could do something clever with this, but the execution of it just fails. There are good performances that are trapped in this movie, but it's abundantly clear that this was pulled from pillar to post, especially in terms of its post-production. But honestly, the problem started with the script, because they didn't know how to approach the material, and by the time they finished the movie, they still didn't know what they were doing with it. It looks like it was cobbled together to make 90 minutes, and if you're the kind of person that enjoys analysing and deconstructing movies, especially ones like this, to see what they were originally like and to try and figure out what decisions were made to try and change things and fix things allegedly, you might have some interest in The Exorcism, but for most viewers, unfortunately, it just ends up being something that is largely irredeemable. If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip at my Ko-fi page or YouTube's Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video. Or, if it possesses you, you can go to my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server, and you can join YouTube memberships for similar perks. Or you can simply like, share and subscribe, it all helps. Until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.